On the morning of June 4, 1942, Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stood on the bridge of his flagship Akagi, watching a battered American bomber bear down on him through a wall of anti-aircraft fire. The plane was already dying, riddled with holes, one wheel shot away. Its pilot fighting controls that no longer fully answered him. By every rule the Japanese Navy had taught its officers about the American character, that pilots should have already turned for home. Imperial doctrine held that American aviators raised in a soft, individualistic culture would break off an attack rather than die for it. Instead, the bomber kept coming, leveling out so low over the flight deck that men on the bridge ducked instinctively, certain it was about to crash directly into them. It missed by feet and plunged into the sea beyond. Nagumo's officers recorded their reaction in the after-action report filed that week. Shock. Something closer to disbelief. They had trained their entire careers around the assumption that this enemy would not do what they had just watched it do. That single bomber run was a preview of something far larger. In the hours that followed, squadron after squadron of American torpedo bombers, slow, obsolete, flying without fighter escort, carrying torpedoes that often failed to detonate even when they hit, pressed their attacks into the same wall of fire, absorbing catastrophic losses, because someone had given the order and the men flying those planes intended to carry it out. By the time the sun set on June 4, 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers were burning wrecks at the bottom of the Pacific. And the officers who survived that day spent years afterward trying to explain, in post-war memoirs and interrogations, what they had actually seen, men who flew toward their own deaths with a discipline the Imperial Navy had never believed the American character could produce. By the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had not lost a major fleet engagement in living memory. Pearl Harbor, the fall of Singapore, the conquest of the Dutch East Indies. The string of victories since December 1941 had been so comprehensive, so one-sided, that Japanese naval planners were operating from an assumption that bordered on certainty, that the war in the Pacific would be decided on terms Japan controlled, against an enemy whose resolve had not yet been tested and, by Japanese reckoning, would not hold. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan for Midway was built on that assumption, refined into a specific strategic calculation. Lure the remaining American carriers, battered but intact after the gut punch of Pearl Harbor, into a decisive engagement near a small atoll in the Central Pacific. Destroy them in a single overwhelming action. Force a negotiated peace before American industrial power could fully mobilize and turn the war into the kind of extended production contest that Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and traveled extensively in the United States before the war, privately understood Japan could not win. The plan depended on more than ships and aircraft. It depended on an assessment of the men flying and crewing the American fleet, and that assessment, baked into Japanese naval doctrine through years of pre-war training, was badly mistaken. Japanese officers were taught a specific characterization of the American military temperament. Pilots flying against the Japanese fleet were expected, according to standard doctrine, to break off an attack rather than press it to a suicidal conclusion. Japanese aviators were later documented describing the lesson explicitly, that Americans would avoid death at all costs, and would flee if given the opportunity. It was not a casual assumption. It was institutional doctrine, taught in training, embedded in tactical planning, treated as a reliable input for calculating how American forces would behave under pressure. The American carrier force waiting to defend Midway did not, on paper, look capable of overturning that assumption. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and a hastily repaired Yorktown, still showing battle damage from the Coral Sea engagement 3 weeks earlier, patched together by round-the-clock work at Pearl Harbor's dry docks in a span of 72 hours that naval engineers considered barely possible. Against them, Yamamoto's combined fleet fielded 4 fleet carriers, 11 battleships, and dozens of supporting cruisers and destroyers spread across multiple coordinated task forces, including a diversionary strike toward the Aleutian Islands meant to split American attention and forces. By every conventional measure of naval power, hulls, aircraft, guns, tonnage, the Japanese fleet held an overwhelming advantage. What Japanese commanders could not see, and could not have planned for, was the one advantage the Americans actually held. Not numbers. Intelligence. Navy cryptanalysts working in a basement at Pearl Harbor under Commander Joseph Rockefort had been chipping away at the Japanese JN-25 naval code for months, piecing together fragments of intercepted traffic with a combination of mathematical rigor and educated guesswork. By late May 1942, Rockefeller's team had broken enough of the code to determine that Midway was the target of Japan's next major operation, and, through a deliberately planted false signal about a water shortage at Midway that the Japanese unknowingly repeated in their own coded traffic, confirmed it beyond reasonable doubt. American commanders knew, with unusual precision, when and from which direction the Japanese carrier force would strike. It was an advantage of knowledge, not strength. The American fleet that sailed to meet Yamamoto's armada was still smaller, still outgunned, still flying aircraft that were, in several critical respects, inferior to their Japanese counterparts. The torpedo bomber squadrons assigned to deliver the first American strikes flew the TBD Devastator, a design that had been state-of-the-art when it entered service in the mid-1930s and was, by June 1942, dangerously obsolete. Slow. Lightly armed. Carrying the Mark 13 torpedo, a weapon with a well-documented and deeply troubling failure rate, torpedoes that ran too deep beneath their targets, torpedoes that failed to arm on contact, torpedoes that simply did not detonate even when they struck their mark squarely. 3 full squadrons of these aircraft would attack the Japanese carrier force that morning. They would fly without fighter cover, directly into a combat air patrol of Japanese Zero fighters, the most capable carrier-based fighter aircraft in the world at that point in the war, and into a wall of anti-aircraft fire thrown up by the entire Kido Butai battle group. The conditions left almost no realistic chance of survival. Almost none at all. The men who flew into them knew it before they took off. At 0710 on the morning of June 4, the first American strike reached the Japanese carrier formation. It was not a coordinated, textbook assault. It was 6 brand new TBF Avengers and 4 Army Air Force B-26 Marauders, bombers never designed for naval torpedo attacks, crewed by men improvising a tactic they had barely trained for, thrown into the fight because they were available and the moment demanded action rather than preparation. Lieutenant Herbert C. Mays was flying one of those B-26s. His aircraft, already heavily damaged by anti-aircraft fire and losing control, passed so close over Akagi's flight deck that Admiral Nagumo and his bridge officers had to duck for cover, certain the plane was about to crash directly into the carrier's island structure. It missed. It went into the sea beyond. Of the 4 Marauders in that first strike, 2 never returned. It was the opening note of a morning that would only intensify. Beginning at 0918, Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet attacked the Japanese carriers, 15 TBD Devastators, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, flying completely alone. No fighter escort. No support from the dive bombers that should have arrived at roughly the same time but had become separated during the long flight from their carriers, searching empty ocean for a fleet that had altered course. Waldron's squadron pressed the attack anyway. All 15 aircraft were shot down. Every single one. Only a single man survived, Ensign George Gay, who ditched his shattered plane in the water and spent the remainder of the battle hiding beneath his deflated life raft, watching the rest of the engagement unfold around him from the surface of the Pacific, alone, certain he was the last living member of his squadron. Minutes later, Torpedo Squadron 6 from USS Enterprise attacked in the same conditions, against the same wall of Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Of 14 aircraft, only 5 returned. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from USS Yorktown went in with 12 aircraft. Only 5 survived that attack as well. By the time the last of the torpedo squadrons had made its run, the totals were almost impossible to absorb. Of 41 American torpedo bombers that flew against the Japanese fleet that morning, 37 were shot down. Not a single torpedo struck a Japanese ship. By the narrowest measure of tactical success did the attack achieve its stated objective. It was total failure, and an extraordinarily costly one, paid for in the lives of men who had launched from their carriers knowing the odds and gone in anyway. What none of the surviving aircrew, and none of the Japanese officers watching from the decks below, could fully appreciate in the moment was what those attacks had actually accomplished, not by sinking ships, but by shaping the next 6 minutes of the battle in ways that would prove decisive. The repeated waves of low, slow torpedo attacks had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to wave-top altitude, where the Zeros were forced to chase the American planes at the lowest possible elevation, burning fuel, expending ammunition, and positioning themselves entirely wrong for what was about to arrive from above. At the same time, Japanese carrier decks remained cluttered with fueled, armed aircraft, as commanders scrambled to respond to wave after wave of incoming attacks rather than completing the launch of their own strike against the American carriers, a strike that had been delayed, rearmed, and delayed again as the tactical picture shifted by the minute. At approximately 10:22, dive bombers from Enterprise, the squadron's designated Bombing 6 and Scouting 6, arrived directly overhead. The timing was not the product of careful coordination. It was, in significant part, an accident of circumstance, the convergence of separate flights that had each struggled to locate the enemy fleet and happened to arrive at almost the same moment the Japanese combat air patrol was at its lowest altitude, fully committed against the torpedo planes below. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the attack down out of the clear morning sky. There was almost nothing standing between the American dive bombers and the Japanese flight decks below, no fighters at altitude to intercept them, no time for Japanese gun crews to fully reposition. Within 6 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were all left burning. Their flight decks, packed with fueled aircraft and unsecured ordnance prepared for the launch that had never happened, turned into infernos that spread through the ship's interiors with a speed that no damage control effort could contain. Captured Japanese officers interrogated after the war described the totality of what followed in stark terms. Direct hits that ignited fires the crews could not extinguish. Internal explosions that continued through the remainder of the day and into the night, as stored ordnance and aviation fuel cooked off deck by deck. Eventually, on each burning carrier, the order that no captain wanted to give, scuttle the ship, or finish her off with a friendly torpedo, because there was no longer any possibility of saving her. Hiryu, the fourth Japanese carrier, escaped the initial strike and launched her own counterattack against the American fleet, wounding Yorktown severely. She was hit by American dive bombers later that same afternoon. She suffered the same fate as the other three. In the span of a single morning, the 4 aircraft carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, the operational core of the force that had seemed, until that day, unbeatable, were gone. Commander Mitsuo Fukita had led the first wave of the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. At Midway, he was aboard Akagi, recovering from an emergency appendectomy, a spectator to the disaster rather than a participant in it. He survived the sinking of his own carrier and, years later, co-authored with Masateko Kumiya the first major Japanese-language account of the battle, published in Japan in 1951 and translated into English in 1955 under the title Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan. The book documented, from inside the Japanese fleet, what its authors described as the unsparing heroics of doomed American aircrews pressing attacks that offered no realistic chance of survival. It became, for decades, the primary Western window into how the Japanese Navy had experienced the battle from the other side of the guns. What is independently documented, outside of Fukita's contested narrative, is the scale of what Japan lost that day, in ships and in men. Captain Amagai, captain of the carrier Kaga, told American interrogators after the war that of the roughly 1,500 crew aboard his ship, around 800 were lost. Multiply that loss across the other 3 carriers, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu, and the total Japanese casualty figure for the morning and afternoon of June 4 climbed well past 2,000 sailors and airmen killed. Among them were some of the most experienced carrier aviators in the Imperial Japanese Navy, men who had trained for years, who had flown over Pearl Harbor, whose skill and experience represented a depth of institutional knowledge that Japan's wartime aircrew training pipeline would prove unable to replace at anything close to the rate the war was about to demand. Japanese after-action reports from the battle, examined by post-war historians working from documents recovered after the war and from interrogation transcripts, recorded a recurring and unsettling theme. The willingness of American aircrews to press their attacks under conditions that Japanese doctrine had assumed would break their resolve was not an isolated observation from a single officer's account. It appeared across multiple recollections of the battle's opening hours, men who had been taught one thing about the American character watching, in real time, the opposite play out in front of them. The reaction at the highest levels of the Japanese government followed a different pattern entirely. Emperor Hirohito, briefed on the disaster the day after the battle, responded not with a reassessment of strategy but with an order that Japan's navy must not lose its fighting spirit, and that future operations continue to be conducted with boldness and aggression. The lesson the Imperial High Command drew from Midway was not caution. It was resolve, redoubled, applied to a strategic situation that had just been transformed against Japan in ways that would prove irreversible. Meanwhile, the Japanese government concealed the true scale of the defeat from its own public for weeks. When the loss was eventually acknowledged, the official account admitted to the destruction of only 2 carriers rather than all 4, a deception maintained in part by the Imperial Navy's decision to disperse surviving Midway crew members to remote postings scattered across the Pacific, isolating them from each other and from any opportunity to speak openly about what they had witnessed. The effect of that concealment outlasted the war itself. For years afterward, the full Japanese account of what their own officers had seen in those few hours remained fragmented, scattered across post-war memoirs, prisoner interrogation transcripts, and the painstaking reconstruction work of historians piecing together a story that Japan's wartime government had worked deliberately to erase. Of the 41 American torpedo bomber crewmen who attacked the Japanese fleet on the morning of June 4, 1942, the overwhelming majority did not survive the day. They did not sink a single ship. Their attacks achieved none of their stated tactical objectives. By any conventional military measure, what torpedo squadrons 8, 6, and 3 accomplished that morning was catastrophic failure: men and aircraft expended, ordnance spent, and nothing to show for it on any ledger that counted ships destroyed or targets hit. That is the accurate accounting. It is also, without context, almost entirely misleading. History has a way of making decisive moments look inevitable in retrospect, as if the dive bombers were always going to arrive at exactly the right instant, as if the Japanese combat air patrol was always going to be at wavetop altitude when McCluskey's planes appeared overhead, as if the 6 minutes that destroyed 3 Japanese carriers were a foregone conclusion waiting to be reached. They were not. The arrival of Bombing 6 and Scouting 6 at the precise moment the Japanese fleet was most vulnerable was partly the product of Rockefeller's intelligence, partly McCluskey's navigation through an empty Pacific after a lengthy search for a fleet that had altered course, and partly the accumulated effect of torpedo squadron after torpedo squadron going in without support, without a reasonable chance of survival, and without turning back, keeping Japanese commanders reactive, keeping Japanese flight decks cluttered, keeping the Zeros at the wrong altitude at the wrong moment. The battle turned in 6 minutes. The 6 minutes were made possible by the hours before them. Military historians have broadly assessed Midway as the decisive naval engagement of the Pacific War, the moment Japan lost the strategic initiative it would never recover, the point after which the question was no longer whether the United States would win, but only how long and at what cost. The 4 carriers Japan lost that afternoon were not simply 4 ships. They were a disproportionate share of Japan's experienced carrier aviation capability, the trained pilots and aircrew who formed the core of a system that Japanese industry and Japanese training pipelines would prove unable to replace at anything close to the pace the subsequent years of war demanded. What the surviving Japanese officers carried home from June 4 was something more specific than the memory of a tactical defeat. It was the recognition, documented in after-action reports, in post-war interrogations, in the memoirs of men who spent years trying to find the right words for it, that an enemy their doctrine had taught them to discount had, in fact, done the thing their doctrine said he would not do. Repeatedly. Under fire. In full view of the men whose training had told them it was not possible. The Japanese Navy's pre-war assessment of the American character had not been contemptuous, exactly. It had been analytical, a reading of a culture and a society, translated into operational doctrine, held with enough institutional confidence that it shaped tactical planning at the highest level. The men who watched wave after wave of American torpedo planes come in that morning were not watching something that surprised them abstractly. They were watching something that contradicted the specific prediction their institution had made about this specific enemy. History remembers Midway as a code-breaking triumph. It was that. Rockefeller's work gave American commanders the information that put their fleet in the right ocean at the right time, and without it, none of what followed would have been possible. But the codebreakers in Honolulu did not fly the missions. The men who turned a calculated intelligence advantage into an actual victory were the aircrews who launched from their carriers anyway, against odds their own commanders understood to be close to suicidal, and pressed their attacks in until they could not press them anymore. And the Japanese officers who watched them come, and wrote their after-action reports, and gave their post-war testimony, and published their memoirs, they kept returning to the same attempt to describe the same thing, because they had been trained to expect one kind of enemy and discovered, too late to alter the outcome, that they had found a different kind entirely. The 41 torpedo bomber crews who flew that morning. 37 of them shot down. The dive bombers that arrived 6 minutes later, into a sky those 37 had cleared. The books give us the battle. The names are harder to find.